Hi everyone, welcome. The system that you see here was last shown in a video 15 days ago, and it was at that time we did the second haul out of worms out of the two systems that make up the material that's in here. So basically there were two sister bins running in which we were hauling worms out, and then after the last check-in 15 days ago we did the second haul out and we consolidated the material into a single bin. And then I set up bait stations in the hope that we can hopefully round up stragglers and maybe end up with some depopulated castings here. So my aim today after 15 days of baiting was to see if we can round up the worms that came together, and also at the same time gauge whether or not further baiting is needed or whether this is now a harvestable batch of castings. And at that same time, 15 days ago, when we hauled the worms out of these two systems, that was the second haul out. It was actually the first haul out was 36 days ago. So those 36-day-old systems that we launched with the worms from there are all the way over at the other end of my wormery over here. And we can even see some of the cardboard and paper and stuff that made up the horizontal migration feeding zones. These systems also got fed 15 days ago when we did the haul out of worms. We fed these systems, added the worms. I've got some worm count information compiled from everyone's comments. So once we get these systems up on the bench, I'll share some of that information with you. But we're going to begin by extracting the bait stations from the old senior parent bin and try to gauge whether or not further rounding up of stragglers is needed. So let's get started with that. So now after deploying these bait stations, I had plastic covering these things to keep moisture over here, and then I came back a few days ago, maybe 5-6 days ago, to pop these little newspaper tops on just to kind of keep moisture down in there, and then I removed the plastic. So the idea was that moisture would remain in here while the surrounding materials are left to dry a little bit. The whole idea of that was to give the worms an incentive to head towards the contents of the bait station, which were meant to be damp and cozy while the surrounding material was left to further dry. So I think the way to do this really quick is to sort of try to catch the worms before they split from the surrounding material, if there are still any worms in the surrounding material. Hopefully they've all, for the most part, assembled within the bait stations. But in case there's still a few hanging out nearby in the castings, this would usually be the time to catch them before they wriggle away out of view. But it does seem like we've managed, for the most part, to collect the most of them in the bait stations. I mean, I just found two in a little mound of material around this bait station. The one that I pulled out of here, I found nothing, which was kind of promising. Now I'm kind of digging down deep where the material is kind of protected from drying by being at the very bottom. A lot of times the worms do tend to hang out down there because the material is a bit more damp, but I did actually attempt to stir all this material up quite thoroughly, and in the hopes that I'd be combining some of the dry stuff that was out on the surface during the migration when we had set up the horizontal migration feeding zone in the previous configuration when it was still two bins. And I blended in a lot of dry material to make the stuff in general quite dry. It's like here too, a worm doesn't look too healthy for lack of moisture. So as I make my way to the very bottom, I'm still finding a worm or two. I'm not quite sure what the threshold is going to be. If I find a large number of worms still in little pockets, then maybe establishing one more round of baiting worms out of this stuff would be worthwhile. But so far, the only worms, with the exception of those two that we found at the very bottom over on that end, and we pulled those out, all the other worms were just the other two that were near the bait stations. So far it's beginning to give me that feeling like this material has, for the most part, been depopulated. Every now and then I'm just sort of bumping into a little bit of leftover food or bedding material or something that seems easy enough to just fish out and remove. As you saw, I did manage to find one more worm as I was sort of tilling around in the material that's down low. Here's another one. It does seem like, a random worm here or there is more the exception than the rule at this point. I'm definitely getting that feeling like perhaps this material is at this point depopulated enough to the point where we can consider it as harvestable. And to me, it just doesn't seem worthwhile to spend any more effort to try to fish out whatever stragglers might still be in the material. I mean, there's a very good chance that there's still a worm or two in this stuff. I mean, if you're a worm farmer like me, you'll know that getting every last worm is typically almost like a statistical impossibility, despite a best effort that one might put in. But I mean, all things considered, I think we were quite thorough, and I think we found very few worms. So I think we'll just do one final quick till and search for stragglers, but I believe at this point it's fair to say that this is a done deal. I'm going to just pretty much write this off as a depopulated batch of castings that could now either go into storage or get used right away. So I think the next step is to, here's another worm. So like I said, getting every single worm out seems almost like an impossibility. So I suppose if this material gets used pretty soon out in the garden, then that'll really just translate into whatever stragglers remain in this material get to go free out into the garden. And that should make them quite happy. So that makes it official. This is now 411 days since this system was launched. 36 days since haul out number 1 occurred. 15 days since haul out number 2 occurred. And today we're going to write this off as a officially depopulated batch of compost. So let's take a quick peek inside these containers, or let's simply empty the containers to see what we ended up with. But we'll do that once we get the 2 bins out here that we're going to be feeding. So why don't we set the finished castings aside, and then we'll examine what's going on inside these things. As I remember, the material that we baited these worms out of was pretty heavily populated, so it is fair to expect that we're going to have a good number of worms in here. It's kind of hard to see what's going on. Hopefully we can eject the contents of these little bait boxes pretty thoroughly. So let's see what we can arrange here. I don't even remember what we used to try to bait the worms. I assume we probably gave them something pretty tasty. We've got a couple nice fat worms hanging out in here. Oh, most of them are down at the bottom, hanging out down low within the bait box. Not sure how easy it is to see them. Luckily they're not little itsy bitsy worms, they're pretty good sized worms. So fishing them out of here should be pretty easy. Hopefully I don't end up regretting saying that and jinxing myself. Alrighty. Does seem like we're getting there. Alright, I can still see a couple down low. That might be it for this bait box. Nope, I still see a couple more. I guess I could always come back to these and verify that we've not left any stragglers behind. But from what I could tell, there's no more in here. I can see a little bit of castings material. Oops. I'm always proven wrong. Every time I try to say something semi-conclusive, I always end up putting my foot in my mouth. I think that's it for this first bait box. Let's just do a quick final probe to see if there's any more worms in there. I believe that that's going to be it for that one. Any other worms elsewhere? Perhaps on this stuff? Maybe it wouldn't hurt to scrape this stuff off too, just in case there's a worm hiding inside that stuff. Yep, as I thought, right there. Trying to evade me, but unsuccessfully. Alright, let's see what we can do as far as getting worms out of the second box. Let's just, for the most part, see if we can plop its contents out. I usually do try to, you know, get feedback from the viewers on what we're seeing here as far as worms that are being launched into a system, and these worms will be launched into these systems here below where I'm working. These are the two 36-day-old systems that I showed earlier. Before we drop in the worms though, we're going to see how things are doing. We're going to install the feeding that I came down here with for them today, and then at the end we'll release the rounded up worms that we baited over here. It does seem to me like I've managed to get the most of them, but there are still a couple more down there. Alrighty. At this point, once again, I'm getting that feeling like I've managed to get them all. Sometimes just saying that out loud is enough to get one more worm to show itself. And then I guess like we did before too, perhaps scraping some of these little openings on the bait station too will reveal another worm or two. But I believe we've now successfully extracted all the worms that we've managed to round up over the past 15 days out of those finished castings. So that'll make it official on the depopulation of the finished castings. So now let's really quick just try to take a closer look at what we ended up with here as far as worms. We've got little jumbles here, which I'm assuming are going to have worms nestled within them. And we might not be able to reveal them all, but we'll be able to hopefully at least get a sense of how many worms have come together over here. I'm starting to get a sense of how many there are here. There's a few. Not a huge amount, but a few. It's a good number here. Mostly somewhat larger worms. A couple little ones too. There's a little one on my finger. So we're going to set these little guys aside, and we'll try to evenly distribute them into the two worm bins. At the end, release them and reunite them with the rest of the crowd that they were separated from over the past few haul outs from the parent bins. So I think it's time to make our way over into the new systems over here and get them fed. So the approach used to round up worms previously was not bait stations, it was migration. So we had simply set up one edge of the bin. There was two bins, so we had set up feeding zones on the edge of the two bins that we were trying to lure the worms out of, and that's what we're seeing here is just the remnants of the bait station, the little dividing walls that we usually put out when we set up the horizontal migration feeding zones. So it seemed to me like if we were to hang on to this stuff, it would make really great bedding material for the next time we came in here to feed. So that was my whole reason for just placing the stuff in here and saving it for today. But for now it's a little bit in the way, so I think I'll just set it aside briefly over there with the worms that we rounded up, just so we could do a quick examination of how things look in here. You could see we had laid out a top covering of newspaper, of which there's very little left here too. So they did seem to appreciate that top covering newspaper that we had placed out underneath the bubble wrap. And look at all those nice beautiful fresh castings that they laid out. That's really nice too. So we would have put the last feeding 15 days ago down the middle, but when I looked at the video briefly, I saw that I had fed stuff like cantaloupe rinds and cucumber peels And it's the sort of stuff that I really didn't think we would see many leftovers of, so okay, well, maybe this little bit of cantaloupe rind right here is pretty much the only stuff that I would expect to find as leftovers from a feeding like that. So you can see the worms are still hanging out in the feeding zone, nibbling off the remainder of what was given to them 15 days ago, but not too surprising that as far as leftovers go, there's minimal amounts of it in here. So they're definitely due for another feeding today. And you know, since these are European night crawlers do have a tendency to really appreciate the bedding that you give them, and they'll gladly allow that to double as their food source. So I didn't worry too much about these little guys going hungry, knowing that these systems are still pretty young, and that if they ran out of the kitchen scraps that I had fed them, then they could easily just turn to the bedding material that makes up the system. But I mean, for 36-day-old systems, I gotta tell you, this stuff really looks pretty heavily worked. Lots and lots of castings piling up in these systems. Both systems. Very nice. You know, before I forget, I think I'd just like to share with you guys really quick some of the information that we've been assembling about these systems here. With everyone's input, we do have estimates for how many worms live in these two systems here. So most of the information on these has been talked about in terms of 15 days since we last checked in, and how the haul outs all worked from the parent bins, and how these are 36-day-old systems. But down here is the key information I wanted to share with you. Bin number 1 over here, the more heavily populated one, just by less than 3 dozen worms, 34 additional worms, 851 worms here, as opposed to 817 worms over here. So certainly not a big difference in terms of how many worms live in each box. And I guess I even thought that perhaps we can try to see if we can possibly add a slightly larger number of worms to bin number 2 to see if we can balance that out. And as always, I always like to poll the viewers to get their input on what they thought they saw as far as how many worms were released into a system during a worm launch. And I'll do the same today. I'm just going to be trying to, well, you can see a lot of these worms have more or less buried themselves down into the material here. So the worms are still here. They're just trying to hide from the bright lights. They don't like the bright lights, so it's not too surprising that they're you know, hiding. But like I said, I'm going to save the release of the worms to the very end. We're going to drop in the foods that they're getting first. And I've got some frozen foods here I'm going to give them. The banana peels are something that tends to go pretty quick, but the corn cobs tend to go quite slow. So I figured corn cobs are the kind of thing to put into somewhat younger bins like these, and then there's plenty of time for them to work the stuff down. Besides corn cob, I've also got a couple other things for them over here on the side. I got some coffee to drop in, but I'm going to sprinkle a little bit of grit over here onto these foods too, just because in my newer systems I always feel like adding a good amount of grit is a good idea. So I like to be generous with the grit in my younger bins. Now here I've got some napkins we're going to drop in here. Here's a somewhat larger one. We can kind of split in half. And while one of those pieces of cardboard I dropped in underneath the food was damp, the one that we dropped into bin number 2 over here, the one we dropped into bin number 1 was dry. Paper that we're dropping in on top is somewhat dry. So hopefully we're not going to be causing too much of a dry shot onto these little wormies in here. But I feel like the material in the bin in general, as I comb through it, is quite damp and comfortable, so I'm not too worried. I have a feeling that the moisture content of the bins will help hydrate the material in here, and the food will bring with it a little bit of moisture. Granted, corn cobs and banana peels are not going to bring with them a great deal of moisture, but a little bit will come in. A little bit will come in as part of the feeding too. So here are those little pieces of paper that also were used to cap off the bait boxes. We'll just put those down in here too. This is also just good bedding material to put in. And then we can start backfilling the feeding zones. Like I usually do, I'll use the backfilling activity as a reason to sort of scoop further out and to reach further out to the edge so that we can at the same time also examine how things in the edge are doing. Everything feels quite nice, good moisture level, lots and lots of castings piling up quite quickly. Pretty good, you know, for systems that have somewhere between 1,800 and 1,900 worms in them. So, yeah, that looks pretty good to me. Let's see how this edge closer to you looks over in bin number 2. Here too, I can feel a good bit of moisture in the material, lots of castings piling up in between the bedding material, worms throughout it. Here, perhaps a little bit more leftover bedding material. Hard to say that it would be due to the estimated 34 fewer worms that live in this box versus the other box. I mean, 34 worms, when you're talking about 1,800 plus, is not that big of a, you know, difference if you ask me. So it almost does seem to me like we've got a couple of systems here that have almost identical setups. Over here I'm seeing a lot of worms hanging out on this edge of the bin. That's pretty nice to see. Pretty much worms everywhere. And lots of castings piling up everywhere too. That's very nice to see as well. Very, very cool. Definitely making good work of the material that we made these systems up out of for them. I guess the plastic coverings are allowing for nice moisture retention, keeping the entire contents of the system nice and cozy so that they feel comfortable exploring all reaches of the bins and working the material down everywhere. So, I don't remember, did we explore this edge on this one too? Can't remember, so we'll just do it again just in case we didn't. Such a scatterbrain sometimes, I can't remember what I did 2 minutes ago. Lots and lots of worms and lots of castings piling up. Very, very nice. Wow, I gotta tell you, castings are so nice and light, so nice and fluffy, light, easily crumbly throughout. Here and there I'm just hitting little jumbles of bedding material that seem to have clumped together, which I always feel like I want to help break it apart a little bit if I can. And at this point I'm more or less leveling things off because the only thing remaining I think is going to be just to plop on our feeding zone indicators. But before we can do that, the final order of business is going to be the release of our little worms. So we can always just sort of follow a semi-unscientific approach and just distribute the piles in such a way that there's some over on this side and there's some over on that side. I'm going to try to spread this little pile of worms out so that we can try to get a better look at how many are being released. It is tough to do because it's kind of gooey and sticky. Let's see how many we've got over here. My hope was that maybe we can add 34 additional worms to bin number 2 and balance out the estimated worm count in the two systems. But I am getting this feeling like we might have dropped a significantly greater number of worms over into bin number 2 just now, so maybe we'll just send a couple of them back over that way. I still do feel like I did add more to bin number 2, hopefully 34 more. So we'll have to see, you know. It's at this point I'll always turn to you guys as the viewers to please provide me with your estimates of how many worms we just added to each system. I'm getting a sense of how many I think I added to each system at this point. So I'll be entering that information into my tracking spreadsheet that calculates our averages. And once I get everyone's feedback through the comments, I'll be including all your numbers into the averaging calculations as well. And then at some point in the near future, I'll announce the updated worm count estimates for these two systems. So I think I've got all the worms off my glove. Nope, there's one more. Let's make sure we don't take them with me over to the sink. I would hate to flush a little guy down the the sink. Just want to keep him in here with his little friends and neighbors. And it's so nice to have finally put an end to that old 411-day system. It took a while to migrate the worms out, but actually the migration in those 2 bins went a little bit more quickly than the previous system, so not quite as lengthy a process as it was when I was migrating worms out of the previously 2 harvested boxes. Alright everyone, I got a couple more things I got to do here in terms of putting stuff away and cleaning things up. But I'm not going to waste your time with that. That's boring. Before I go, really quick, let me just say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. Alright everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.